I want us to get started right away. So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Andew Mallon, and he is a serial entrepreneur and investor, and he is an SBIR guru, having raised over 10 million, probably higher than that since the last time in SBIR funds. He is CEO of Trovex BioTherapeutics, as well as Calista Therapeutics. He has experience with moving biotechnology products through the regulatory process. Today, he will be talking with us about the challenges of navigating intellectual property. So I'll pass it over to you, Andrew. Thank you for joining us today. Oh, I forgot to mention, and that lovely SBIR specific aims template, we got it from him. So it's a proven template. $10 million behind it.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I'm just going to. So I just shared my screen, I hope, and you should be able to see the slide showing mapping innovation to impact. Can everybody see that okay? And hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So I'm going to run through this, and I'm doing this on the using my pitch deck template that I use and that I encourage others to use, and that we generally see through the VC work that I do as a way of conceptualizing the entire process and also opening up to discussions about any particular part of it. The focus here is also going to be specifically on the intellectual property, and intellectual property is a very important aspect, especially really early on. One of the nice things and one of the problems looking at the very early stage of biotech development is that's the stage at which a lot of sort of structural mistakes can happen, especially strategic mistakes. And the most common one I would say I see is in academic and grant-based activities as they try to translate into commercial opportunities. And the reason for that is that the NIH has a lot of goals and a lot of funding streams for strategies that are national strategies, but they're often divorced from commercial realities. And so you often find projects get to a certain stage where they're doing something that is on mission with society at large, but is off mission for commercial goals. And it's fascinating to see that. And so it's also very important those early stages to be able to pivot a company to have a commercially viable strategy, whilst still being able to keep some of that initial focus. An example of that happened very recently, actually. I was looking at a company as a CEO, potential CEO spot, and it's a little off topic from sort of drug abuse, but it's an excellent example. It's probably one of the best examples of having to pivot something. They had been looking at ear and hearing loss, and were looking at tinnitus, and tinnitus has never been, fixed, and the chances of ever getting tinnitus fixed are I would say zero. There's no real interest in it in pharma or in biotech investors, because it's been done to death, and success in models doesn't turn into success in the clinic. And you can see that for a lot of things like stroke, Alzheimer's disease nowadays, and a whole plethora of different disorders. And then the funny thing was, I went to them and was looking through it, and I managed to identify that they had actually almost serendipitously, almost mistakenly uncovered a type of hearing loss that could be predicted. And I was able to build from a program where they would be able to pre-treat surgical patients who were experiencing hearing loss, and it completely provided this enormous opportunity for them to pivot what they had and the information they had that they didn't really know that they had into a really valuable commercial opportunity. And so it's very important often to get people like myself involved in early stage companies, because we can look at things very quickly, determine that there's a real avenue here that investors would jump on and would see the value of, and help companies to adjust. And one way of doing that process is simply to go through the company as a business, and the pitch deck is the new business plan for that, and that's the way that we can enunciate that process. So looking at the new product development process, there's discovery, opportunity recognition, feasibility, intellectual property and regulation right up at the beginning, and then development of your prototype, markets, launch strategy, business plan, and launch. And there's a whole other aspects within that. So our objectives here are going to be looking at the pitch deck, and the pitch deck is a very simple thing, and the simpler it is, the better, because investors are dumb and people are dumb, and unless somebody is in your company and has your knowledge of your solution for your problem, or your vista to that problem, your understanding of that problem, which can be quite unique within each discipline, they won't have a clue what you're talking about. And the most important thing is to treat people who are reading your pitch as if they know nothing, they're not even scientists, and dumb it down as much as possible so that everybody understands. Because often with the pitch deck, you know, you're going to get people who are not going to understand things on the same level, and then they'll bring in people to do due diligence like myself and scientific domain experts and clinicians to tear apart, you know, the sort of more heavy duty scientific and clinical plans that you have, the due diligence documents that will be prepared. So the solution, so we split it down to 4 simple things: the problem, you know, whatever it is; the solution, what you're proposing; the team, which almost has to go at the beginning. If you've got a good team, that's what people invest in 9 times out of 10, unfortunately. And if you don't have a good team, you have to create one. And then the investment. What do you want? What are you going to spend it on? What's that going to create in terms of value and for the investors? And then IP strategy within that. So the first thing is the value proposition. The value proposition is it's like an elevator pitch, and it's the tiniest amount of information that should allow them to have a conceptual understanding. And the hope with this opening slide, just like with an elevator pitch, is they immediately get it. You know, they get what you're asking about. So I'm using an example example pitch deck and program that I've been developing at Trovex Therapeutics with opioids in order to make this more appropriate for the audience. So I'm looking at, I'm going to just go through this. So the first thing I point out is that 91% of recovering opioid addicts relapse, 49,000 die from overdose annually, and there's about 2.7 million addicts. So that's the problem. And very quickly, I demonstrate that there's a massive market, and it's life and death. And I identify it with things that most people can understand without having to go into any sort of scientific detail. That's a problem. And then I identify the opportunity. Naltrexone is an FDA-approved drugs that blocks opioids. It reduces cravings and prevents fatal overdose. Currently, addicts stop taking it and relapse. So I've demonstrated part of the problem as well with them not taking current naltrexone, but also the fact that there's something out there that's a solution. And then I finish off the solution by saying we're developing a proprietary rod, proprietary as in we have intellectual property, that's implanted for 6 to 10 releases naltrexone constantly. Dead simple. You should get that. And then finally, money. We want $16 million over 3 to 4 years to FDA approval. Speak to will understand that FDA approval means a massive value inflection. I mean, approval, not just an IND, not just first-in-man studies for a clinical trial or a phase 2 clinical trial showing efficacy in a small number of patients. FDA approval. And of course, most investors understand that financial projections are going to be wrong, but most understand that $60 million is a sufficient amount to get a lot done. So it's not too low, it's not too high. And then finally, it's $1 billion plus market, and that's there for people who don't understand, you know, exactly the sort of figures that we're talking about. So already there's a conceptual framework for what the problem is, and that's something you have to do with all of these things. You start with almost with your title of your slide deck. And your title of your slide deck should be like a conceptual you know, summary in itself, and you're basically starting in a pyramid where you have these conversations like the elevator pitch is the first part of that. And you're expanding and expanding it. And the only way you get to expand down the pyramid into the minutiae of detail and the investment of the person who's going to look at that detail is by having sequential success in every progressive interaction, starting with the title, the value proposition, or / elevator pitch, then into the full pitch, and then into a business plan, perhaps, a research plan, clinical protocols, etc. Massive expansion of due diligence that would happen when you're looking for a term sheet. So the next, I'm going to start teasing out the problem in more detail. So a lethal opioid crisis, every pitch deck's, you should have the same sort of mantra in terms of trying to conceptualize and build everything in this sort of pyramid, so that the title just on itself explains it. And if somebody's just flicking through this, because you could have a VC firm will easily get 1,000 pitches a year, as they flick through them, you don't want them to really need to read the minutiae. You want them to be able to skim through the headings and basically have the value proposition reinforced. So with this one, you can see how I develop out the explanation of the problem. Increased opioids for pain caused the opioid crisis, for anybody who didn't know. There's greater than 2.1 US opioid use disorder patients. Inadequate treatments, so there's a need. There's 91% relapse rates. I'm focusing in now on exactly where we're going after. 42,249 overdose deaths. That's probably out of date already. And $500 billion societal cost per annum. So it's a massive problem, and it's a big market. So it's of interest to investors. And investors are looking for things that can return, I would say, $100 million a year at least, and preferably as much as possible, without sounding ludicrous. So the next one, I just go into more detail about the opioid epidemic. And this is the sort of include perhaps and maybe skip, because there's a lot of detail, but it's the sort of things that many people would want to be able to look over. And I would normally not go into too much detail on this unless it was investors who need much, much more information. And again, same sort of idea, the opioid epidemic, just increasingly explaining just how prevalent the problem is. And then current care spending, just explaining how there is a market there that can be bitten into or expanded. So that's important, because the worst thing you want to be in a situation is to have no market. I mean, some people, it's a funny thing, a lot of people will develop products and the product doesn't have a market yet, and that's a real big problem. A good example of it, actually, from the point of view of this particular project, would be Alkermes and Vivitrol. And so Vivitrol was an intramuscular injection that lasts a month of Naltrexone and is the main competitor. But when Vivitrol first came out, it took a long time for it to be adopted by prescribers, because they were getting prescribers to switch from oral Naltrexone to injectable. And at the same time, they were really creating a new market, because people really were using this type of product, and they spent countless millions of dollars developing the market. We're now fortunate that that market exists, and we can now erode market share. It's a lot cheaper to erode an existing validated market than it is to create a new one. Even if the ad exists, even though oral naltrexone already exists, it's much more difficult to develop this depot 1 month idea and get it into the hands of judges and penal institutions and everything that Alkermes had to do, than it is to simply, walk in like I'm proposing to do, where Alkermes has already done the hard work and have a substandard product, and we have something that lasts longer and safer, etc., etc. That's great, and investors understand that ease to market. I'm actually doing another program that exemplifies that. I recently got a notice of intent to award for my own SBIR grant for an ophthalmology project at Calista, and it's a good example of this phenomenon. It's almost a boring example, but the one that's like very, very common in the pharma industry. So I'm working on something for a wound disorder in the eye, where the eye loses innervation, growth factors don't work, and the eye gets progressively wounded. Dompé recently came out with an NGF protein for the eye. It has to be taken every 2 hours, 6 times a day. It has to be frozen until it gets to the patient. They have to then refrigerate it, and it's a complete nightmare. I've got something that will last a day with a single dropper and can be stored at room temperature, so better compliance. And time and again, there's been examples in the pharma industry for something that's just minutely better becomes a blockbuster. The best example of that is Zantac. which is ranitidine, versus Tagamet, which was cimetidine, as a histamine antagonist for the stomach. They were almost exactly the same efficacy. There was only a single difference in their side effect profile, which Zantac, Pfizer, leveraged with older men to make Zantac the preferred product, and stole most of the market share away from cimetidine. And so very, very boring change, but very, very able to become a blockbuster product. And it's funny to say that these types of examples are very, very common, especially in psychiatry, where you often have new drugs coming out that are very little different older drugs, but are simply extensions. And we see that in almost every drug class nowadays, where there's very limited improvements, but they're able to gain market share. And that's very good commercially, but also runs counter, as you know, to the sort of aspirations we all have to bring out something that's a real massive leap forward. And so you have to balance those two aspirations of investors and the markets, and what people are willing to take risks with your own expectations for having a massive impact. It's kind of a tricky thing. So I also now look into things like the current treatments. So you want to expand your explanation of what's out there, where use fit into an already existing market in this case. So here I point out methadone and buprenorphine maintaining opioid addiction, which is in some ways the best option for most addicts, and naltrexone. And I start to focus in here on naltrexone's niche within treatment panoply. And I point out that it's been FDA approved, so it's safe. So that's a big, big plus. That allows you to use the FDA 505(b)(2) route. Point out that it's non-narcotic, non-addictive, so you don't have the same problems with prescribing it and storing it and patients using it in various different ways. And I point out that there's already a daily dose and there's an injectable, and I can point out that it blocks craving. So starting to build up the knowledge base of this solution for the investors. And then a little bit more science. We start to explain that, this is an opioid blocker, and explain how it actually affects. And most investors will understand this, that it's something that's competitively antagonizing the opioid receptor and preventing opioid agonists from binding. And then, as I sort of touched on, validating clinical competition before, the biggest problem we have in medicine and in drug development, especially at these early stages, is having preclinical data that can be validated and that is clinically predictive. I mentioned that with a couple of different examples: Alzheimer's disease, stroke, tinnitus. They have two problems that you always want to avoid. The first problem is there's no successful compounds out there, largely speaking. And so you can't have a clinical comparator in your animal model that says this works as well as this does, or this works just like this does, and so this could probably work just as well in the clinic. And the second problem, which is tied to that, is not having models that are clinically predictive in and of themselves. And it's in the brain, that's the biggest problem, really. I mean, most of the models we have are not great, or just simply don't exist. And so it really hampers your ability to translate things. Before, Calista was initially focused on an example of one of the best clinical opportunities in models, cystic fibrosis. And in cystic fibrosis, there's no valid animal model. The gold standard model is an in vitro model, which is just perfect. It's lung tissues harvested from cystic fibrosis patients who are getting a lung transplant. They take the old lung tissue and you mount it in a sort of Fran cell, Using cell chamber, and you take the actual human tissue and you apply drugs to it, and you can measure the response to the drug with things like the mucus layer, and which is clinically relevant, and also to the way in which the CFTR channels are gating the ions. And the nice thing about that is that you can then put on clinical comparators which affect that and are clinically known to work, and you can test your own drugs and you can test them in combination with these other drugs, and you get complete insight into what you're going to see in the clinic. And it's such an accurate representation that you can literally take clinical results and preclinical results and arithmetically extrapolate between the two. And that is a very rare thing in medicine, and it was what managed to drive cystic fibrosis to becoming more like a chronic disease rather than a life-shortening disease. And I worked quite a bit recently on trying to develop models like that, including at Yale in Hyde Park, developing stem cell models that we can use from patients or derived from patients, so that we can have that similar in vitro, ex vivo type of models. But being able to have that combination of a really good model that's predictive, in vitro if possible, in vivo usually, and be able to say, here's how things work like that clinically, and here's how they work preclinically, and then here we are. Having those relationships, those benchmarks are critical to improving investor confidence, especially in neuroscience development, and they are elusive. So, for example, in this one, I point out also that there's money involved, and that there's a market, there's an unmet need, and that there's sales, and that this is a very healthy market that we can bite into. I point out, that in the clinical trials, 40% failed to return when they were taking Vivitrol. So there's and prescribers are aware that this is an unmet need, and so they're looking for new products. I point out the sales, 315 billion, now higher, and the growth, $1 billion by 2021 just for Vivitrol. And the fact that Vivitrol accounts for 25% of the revenues of Alkermes, and Alkermes is a $9 billion market capitalization. So for investors, that indicates that the transfer of, or the translation of 300 million in sales doesn't sound that much compared to a $9 billion cap, but when you can establish how these types of assets convert into value in a company, then they can make back of the envelope calculations into exactly what sort of upside they're looking at. And whilst this is a big upside, even a fraction of that wouldn't improve investor confidence in a proposal. So I also point out how the current formulations are inadequate, and explain why this is a problem, and just layering on explaining why there's a market opportunity here. And in this case, it's because the current options don't deliver effective doses, the patients stop taking them and return to opioid abuse. And then I explain exactly what our innovation is. So in this case, it's a 6-month controlled release polyurethane depot. It's, to be honest, pretty boring. People have used polyurethane before, like Probufene, or that's EVA, sorry, not Probufene. I'm going to forget the one that's also Probufene. I've got a list of all the different polyurethane implants, but it's a very boring technology, really. It provides zero-order release kinetics, so you get this really, really nice effect, which is in the graph, showing how it maintains its effect, and very easy to understand. And it also demonstrates how the release is compared to these comparators that are sub-therapeutic after a certain amount of time. I was just speaking with people about Vivitrol, and apparently Vivitrol is now given every 3 weeks, 21 days, because generally clinicians realise that it's not effective for 28 days. And pointing out just how we're able to use the 505(b)(2) route because of the formulation. You can rely on the public information like labelling of previous drugs like Vivitrol and Naltrexone, and allows for a very, very smooth transition to a therapeutic. And please jump in with questions for any of this stuff that we're going over. I'm quite keen to have a back and forth. If you have anything specific to your own development programs, I'm keen to go over this, and we can always go back to these slides afterwards and run back and forth on them. So then I point out key advantages, why would this be, a better product, and also why would it then be welcomed by the market? Advantages over things like buprenorphine and methadone, and advantages over the Vivitrol product, which has these $300 million in sales. So I want to focus a little bit now on intellectual property, break out some of the issues with that. And this is, as I say, extraordinarily important at this stage in a development program, and it's it's a really, really tricky thing to do, because it really takes a lot of strategic thinking, and that's not that difficult thinking. It doesn't take an IP lawyer either. And sometimes you've got to be very IP lawyers, because IP lawyers are looking to get hours, and they get hours by writing patents and submitting patents and getting on that patent bandwagon. And very often that's not the best idea for an early stage company. So to get an IP, it needs to be three things. It needs to be novel, it needs to be useful, and it needs to be non-obvious. That's the three sort of criteria for rejecting a patent as well. And if you're going to get a patent for something that you want the pharma industry to be involved in, then it has to be extremely strong patents. It has to be preferably a novel chemical entity, a new drug, new chemical composition that you've discovered, that sort of level. Or if it's a 505(b)(2), a really strong formulation, which is even then the pharma industry is not that keen on. They prefer to have things that are completely novel, a new target preferably, a new chemical entity, new chemical space even, because by now all the different versions or different chemical entities, a lot of it's been done to death. I mean, there's as you know, the pharma companies have millions of compounds, and things have really been raked over so much. It's sometimes difficult, even when you try for something novel, to get something that's really truly novel as a chemical. So the other option, as I say, is secrets. So you don't have to patent things. You can keep things a secret within your own company. And that's often what the pharma industry will do. When the pharma industry starts a program, you probably heard the statistic that somewhere between 1 out of every 5 to 10,000 lead compound starts is actually successful. We're going to patent all those 5 to 10,000 compounds. And so the best idea, if you can manage it and not publish and not divulge things and keep things secret, is to do that, because then you don't have to patent. You've got a trade, and then you patent at the last possible point, which for me I would say would probably be around the point about the IND filing stage. And that means not publishing. That means not doing presentations, and it's an anathema to academic research. And it's a funny thing. I mean, I've got dozens and dozens of papers worth of research, and I haven't published in years. It's kind of very unfortunate as well, because you really can't publish stuff that you're working on in biotech. You give away your strategy, you give away all of your secrets, and it's a pity at the same time, but it's just a pity of that is based upon the commercial realities of drug development. But it's important to try to understand those and try and find a middle ground between, for academics especially, between being able to publish things and actually be able to move things forward commercially. Because companies who are going to commercially, as a general rule, want to have approval and 10 years of market exclusivity after that. And those 10 years get whittled down at the end by generic competition. Generics will start putting out their own stuff a couple of years before you even lose patent expiration, and they'll fight it out in the courts, make a ton of money, and then just, they won't care about the court process. Basically, they know the courts will last for longer than those 2 years while they're making tons of money. And often the pharma companies have a real battle in their hands at that point to, fight off generics even before the patent's expired. And it takes years for you to build up your market. I mean, with Vivitrol, I think I showed, I might show some here, the schedule that Vivitrol was on in terms of gaining market share. It was glacially slow for like the first 5 years or so. There was very little sales growth, and investors realized that you could have very low sale volume over even 10 years. And so having a patent strategy that gives you as much patent life as possible and the opportunities for new patents such as formulations and various other tricks, is critical. And then the last point I want to mention about is patent examiners. Your patent examiners, it's like getting a reviewer for a grant. They vary so wildly. You can get something approved as a patent and it's actually worthless. And you can get something rejected as a patent and it's actually a great patent. I've seen it all. So a little bit about the IP stages and the costs. And the costs are the real killer. So a provisional patent is a great opportunity to get something patented, and it never gets published. It lasts from year 0 when you apply it to 1, so it's the first 12 months. After that 12 months is up, you then have the opportunity to convert it into a non-provisional patent and a PCT patent. So you don't have to do that. And one of the opportunities at this stage, and I'm probably going to, I fear I'm going to ramble on about things I'm then going to cover later on, so I apologise if I do that. But one of the opportunities with a provisional patent is to simply let it lapse, and then it will disappear. It will never be published. It will never see the light of day, and then refile it as a provisional. And that's called the submarine strategy in IP, where you basically keep on filing the provisional, which is completely confidential, protects you for that 1 year that it's filed from, and you can have it daisy-chained over several years, but it only covers for the last one that you filed. The thing to do is do due diligence to make sure that you've not exposed that product publicly by mistake, and then you can refile, and that allows you to maintain your position to some extent. Because after this point, things get expensive. The provisional application can also be pretty, what's the word, sketchy, you know, and then you can refile it as the non-provisional and spend some money getting it redrawn and putting in extra details, and then then it's going to be the published patent eventually. And then examination, so the non-provisional lasts from year 1 to year 2.5. The examination usually starts about 6 months after you file that non-provisional and can last for years and years and years, especially if you're going back and forth. And then the national phase is when it gets really expensive. That happens at about year 2.5. And the problem is that phase. Once you hit that point, that's when it's really make or break. If you have, so I was lucky with cystic fibrosis, and I think we're lucky with addiction. Addiction really only occurs as a national crisis, as a big market in the US. So I would say you can get away with filing in the US, Canada, and Mexico, because you want to seal the borders. And so the implant strategy for a novel implantable naltrexone is formulation and combination. And I think I might cover that later on. Somebody just asked in the chat. I'll get back to that if I don't cover it soon. So the one thing about the national phase is it costs hundreds of thousands, $50,000 alone to file a Japanese patent. You know, filing it in Europe, filing it in all the individual countries is a nightmare. If you're lucky, you have something like with cystic fibrosis or with addiction. Cystic fibrosis is basically a Caucasian disorder, and it's very rare, and so you can patent it simply in several specific countries, including Hispanic countries like Mexico, and you can cherry pick the companies and reduce your overall exposure to cost, which is what we did. But if you're doing something that's something where there's markets in every single country, like diabetes, for example, you know, or stroke or cancer, then you're going to spend easily $250,000 when you get to that national phase, or you're going to abandon a large parts of the world and maybe just do a US patent. And if you do a US patent, always do Canada and Mexico, because otherwise there'll be the opportunity for people to go and get it for free in Canada or Mexico. And if it's a simple compound, that's a very real possibility. And there's a big market in the US. There's a lot to be said for just having US. But once you get into that situation, you know, and you start losing where it is in the market, investors generally are going to be turned off. So that's one of the best reasons for not, because once you're on that, you know, pathway, it's difficult to get off it. Oops. So IP, defensible or swinging. So patents can be worthless. People patent stuff at an enormous rate, and just because you get a patent doesn't really mean that you've got a patent that's actually, you know, defensible. And defensible means court. You know, people managed to patent the rectangle and the bicycle recently and things like that because they managed to get past some, you know, patent examiner. Often they'll do that as a bit of a prank, but often people will get patents, and when you look at them, you can see that they're not novel. You can see that they're not useful. You can see that they're very obvious things to do, and it just comes down to the luck of the draw. I marked in here CT007. So I had this problem with one of my cystic fibrosis assets, where we took a peptide sequence that was a known sequence, and it didn't work. It wasn't soluble, it wasn't deliverable, and we did medicinal chemistry on it. I think we did something like 7 or 8 different steps, and we showed that if you only did one of the steps, you know, which might be quite obvious, or even 2 of the steps together, it didn't work because of the binding to the peptide to the receptor protein. And so it was very clearly that we had to do a lot of research to really tweak this molecule's medicinal chemistry. And what we did was we added a moiety onto it, that would deliver the peptide. It would detach only within the cell through a special enzyme linkage, and it had special cappings in the end, and it had special conformation so that it would work really well. And compared to the initial one, it was night and day, and we got a patent rejection. And the patent examiner quoted, I think it was 12 references of how it would be obvious to do this. And normally for patent, if you have more than 2 steps of techniques that you've taken from some initial starting point, then that's something that's novel. Unless it's a chemical entity and it's just completely different, that's different. And so we were extraordinarily unlucky, and because this was a bizarre suggestion that she'd made. And the problem with that was that it tied up the intellectual property for years as being, question mark. And so, you can't get something, investors involved if there's a question mark at that stage. And we were very unlucky with that. And that happens. And there was no way to get around that. We were just unlucky. Sometimes you get around that in different ways. We appealed it. We did everything we could. We explained why she was wrong. And the idea that we came to at the end was that this was a troublemaking patent examiner, and she was famous for having these sort of issues and doing this to other people. And that's just, what can you do with that? So the other thing is defensible claims. So just because you have a patent for the bicycle, or a patent for, the way a phone looks, right? Samsung, Apple, or I point out here, CRISPR, which is a bit different. It doesn't mean that you are going to be the final owner. And the final say comes to the Supreme Court sometimes, where people will battle out who is the owner of a technology. And even if your technology is ownership, there's some people out there who have patent positions and that they'll use in order to troll other people out. There's an example of that in the area I'm in. There's a guy called Lance Guberman, who's some character, let's say, and he has patents on implants, and he used those patents on implants and his position as a patent attorney himself, people from developing solutions in implant technology, saying that he had a patent position in it. And as soon as somebody starts to litigate or starts to attack your company on something like IP, it's over, because you don't have the money to fight that off. And there's people out there just looking for targets, and investors are aware of that, and very savvy often about trying to avoid getting into an area where somebody might be able to take advantage of that situation. Because as soon as any sort of litigation starts in a company like that, the money involved is just, incredible, unless you can do it yourself. And even then, you get distracted. So it's a real, issue. As I say, 67% litigation, 3 years, $3 million, that's the sort of costs involved. And so you want really, really strong claims, compositions, formulations, not methods. Methods patents are not useful. There's the exception to the rule, which I always quote, which is the invention of sweetener, saccharin. It was invented by a chemist who was looking at all these compounds, and for some reason he took a little bit of saccharin and tasted it to his tongue and found out it was really sweet. And so he created a method of use patent for using that compound as a sweetener, and made a ton of money, and that's a very, very strong method of use. And another example of that perhaps would be a formulation. A formulation in many ways is a method of using an original composition. So there's ways to have good methods, but having method patents, the majority of them, 99%, are really not useful at all, like using a drug in a type of cancer, a type of dose, things like that. They can easily be gotten around. But a lot of patent lawyers will push for them to be written because they get paid for writing patents. So you've got to be a bit savvy especially when you're only getting your advice from patent lawyers. So another type of IP that is often used is called a continuation in part. So you can extend patents. You can amend the claims by adding new elements. It's a cheap way to do it, but the problem with it is you're taking the initial patent and you're basically expanding what's inside it. You're still trapped with the same priority date. And the priority date is the date at which the clock starts on your 20 years of patent exclusivity. And so if you add claims to an existing patent, which is very common now through this continuation in part, you're just increasing, you're often not getting any extra value. you're sometimes better off just with a new application, a new patent to describe the new claims, because then it starts and it kind of like, it can be useful for extending on your patent life into the market better. And the value that that creates is often illusory of increasing your claims into an existing patent. And it all comes down to how long that patent lives for. I mean, if you've got a patent and you've had it for a year and you want to add new claims, that's brilliant, because you've still got like 19 years left at least. But if you've got a patent that's 10 years old and suddenly you come up with something new and you decide to put it into the old patent, then you only get 10 years of patent protection for that new idea. So it's very important not to be very savvy about the continuation in part. And I mention it particularly because it's very common. I heard recently it's getting less common, perhaps I'm helping with that, but it has a real bit of a bad reputation. So a good example of patent debacles I like to point out is with BRAEBURN-TITAN implant Probufene. And I've been looking at this recently when I was working on patent strategy for the companies I'm working at, and it's instructive as to what can go wrong. So they had 2003 patents, which is very, very old for them, and, you know, and they've been doing things relatively well. They started off quite small though as a sort of startup. So they had 2 patents, one for Naltrexone and others, and one for Risperidone. And they spent millions of dollars in time developing these patents and fighting these patents and getting into a big mess. And the problem they did was they did a continuation in part for the patent A to include any drugs. So the implant with any drugs. And that was a big mistake. And it's a very, very common mistake people do when they're writing patents. You think to yourself, I've got this insight, I've got this patent, you know, it's a formulation of something, and you expand your patent to try and cover as much as possible. And the reason you do that, of course, is to protect what you've got and try to protect as much as possible. But the problem is you can't protect everything. And what often happens is you actually stymie yourself from being able to develop new patents because you've already described something and you don't have the money to capitalize on that. Like, they didn't have the money to develop their implant for any drugs at all, but because they put that in there, they damaged their own product. And this came to light when the examiner came down on them for their Risperidone product. He rejected the patent for B because of prior art in A. So they turned around and said, well, you said any drugs in patent A, so Risperidone is any drug, so that's prior art. And they lost the patent for Risperidone, which was actually a much more valuable commodity because, you know, 1% of people have schizophrenia, much bigger market, and they lost that patent and they had to use the prior patent for it instead, which was earlier. And that plus a couple of other factors really ruined their project. And the license that BRAEBURN had for developing these products was returned to Titan, which was a small company and doesn't have the bandwidth to really run with it. And they've really lost their ability to commercialize that now. In particular, 2003 was the patent. And so 2003 plus 20 years is 2023. And so they're in a situation now where there's very little patent life left, but not really goes up. And, you know, it's damaged their entire ability to commercialize the product because of one decision like that, which is, and it's not a decision that, you know, you couldn't have foreseen, just as you would, like I would foreseen that right there. Anybody could point out to them that that's a mistake, but at the time they thought to themselves, brilliant, we've got this technology, let's cover any potential option. And in reality, nobody was trying to do this. They were the only people trying to do it, and the only people they damaged was themselves. And you know, it's sometimes it's important to have people advise you and look at what you're doing for these key decisions, because often they don't seem like key decisions, and often it seems like the smart thing to do, but often it's not. The smart thing to do was what they were doing, which is having a new patent for Risperidone. One single mistake undermined their entire program. So I mentioned this submarine strategy. Apologies, I always do this. So I've already talked about this. So this is the submarine strategy. You have a provisional patent, confidential, no papers, no talking about it, nothing that can get it out there. And you've got 1 year to convert it. You do due diligence, make sure there's no leaks. and no competitors are working the same thing, and you just let it lapse or convert it and lapse it. Another provisional starts. It's a great way to do it, and you can continually amend your filing and move the priority date up and up and up, so you get the most IP life. You want to go to investors with as close to 20 years of intellectual property as possible, because that just breathes so much life into the room in terms of potential returns. So for drug abuse projects, so I'm talking here now about things like acquisition prevention, so deterrence and respiratory stimulation, tablet weighing, bottles, tamper-proof pill dispensers, things that, excuse me, things that can prevent drug abuse from happening. So I've worked on quite a lot of different projects with people who are looking to work on addiction, because it's become such a recent problem, and there's different things being developed. And I split these into these three categories. Non-opioid drugs, in this case I've worked with cannabinoid drugs with Abide, which was recently acquired by Lundbeck for $250 million. So trying to develop drugs that don't use opioids. And then Naltrexone implants as well, things that can prevent relapse and more importantly prevent overdose. And a lot of people are working on trying to basically prevent acquisition. People are going to be using opioids for pain relief generally. We're hoping we can reduce the number of people who are getting prescribed it, but if you have to be prescribed it, you want to try and prescribe them in a way that can prevent acquisition. And acquisition occurs by people becoming dependent upon them, becoming biologically tolerant to them, and increasing their doses. And I imagine you've got a lot of different things like that yourself. So intellectual property, I wanted to talk a little bit. Somebody asked a question, what was your IP strategy that allowed a novel implantable naltrexone? So I did it over several different things. And quite frankly, I came at this problem saying, how can I create IP? I knew naltrexone worked. I knew there was naltrexone implants out there. And I had friends from alchemies who had worked in this area that I was having conversations about, as I realised that this was an emerging field, and that NIDA had identified a long-lasting naltrexone implant as being an option to pursue. And so we kind of basically sat down and said, how can we create a commercially viable and intellectual property patent sound approach to this? And so we layered into our compound, or sorry, our product, you know, lots of novelty, lots of non-obviousness, lots of steps, so that we knew that we would have something that would be solid. And so the first parts to it is the naltrexone core. I can't talk too much in detail about exactly what these are, because I'm using the Submarine strategy, so I can't go into too much detail. So the first part is the naltrexone core, the actual ingredients that is held within this polyurethane membrane. The polyurethane membrane is just like a cell membrane. It's holding the outside, it's just around the outside, and it's the other part. So the polyurethane membrane is simply a mechanism to prevent the drug inside from eluting at an uncontrolled rate. So a controlled release membrane. Now, having a naltrexone core is pretty boring, I mean, pretty obvious. Having a polyurethane membrane has been done before. Putting the two together, that's pretty obvious, I would say, too. People have done that with any drug before. So we also did a partnership with an established delivery company, and we were exclusively optioning those patents from ourselves to them. So there's opportunities to kind of like, expand what we're doing. And we also did some special things with the polyurethane membrane in order to turn it into something that was very novel. We added novel ingredients to the polyurethane membrane. We also added some novel ingredients to the core, but especially the membrane, the way we did the coating. We came up with some strategies that were provided intellectual property, and that provides us with our formulation patent overall. And so the patent A to the core and patent B, they're the relatively boring things, but once you put everything together and you get a formulation patent, that's where our strength comes, what I would call patent C. And as I say, it's a stealth technology, no public disclosures, because we want to move this as far ahead as possible before we release it. And a lot of what we're doing, the way that we've got quite a novel approach to developing an implant like this, and it could be used for other cores. And so we would like to retain the option to get a Series B or a Series C investment, you know, $60 to $100 million to expand the pipeline, expand the intellectual property base to cover other drugs like risperidone, for example, because the ability to actually use a technology like this, a delivery technology like this, is very broad. You can if you can come up with something successful that can allow people to not take pills, I mean, it's a good opportunity, but it's been very difficult actually to develop these types of things in pharma. People that haven't managed to do it particularly well, but you want to try and keep your options open for that. So it's a little bit about team now. So an example for our team. So a team's tricky, especially if you're a startup. Most of the time, if somebody's asking a question, are formulation patents acceptable by the FDA for regulatory exclusivity? Well, regulatory exclusivity is different from patents. I mean, for exclusivity, you have to for regulatory exclusivity, you have to show that something's novel and has utility. And often the patent isn't how you do that. Often how you do that is with efficacy trials. So I'm working on something like this right now with another project where we're looking to try and get some exclusivity, market exclusivity for 3 years. I think we're eligible for, by showing that we've got something that is an improvement on what's out there. And to be honest, those regulatory exclusivities from the FDA are really, I don't really consider them to be that great, because you're totally talking about a few years. You're not talking about 10 years or 15 years. The best exclusivity you can get from the FDA and from the EU is orphan exclusivity, which provides 7-10 years in the EU, which is really a lot and provides you enough opportunity to actually get there. But if you're relying on regulatory exclusivity from the FDA as a commercial basis, you don't have a commercial basis, because it's just simply not long enough to get sales and to get market share and to get investors interested. But the patents alone wouldn't be sufficient. You would need to show utility in the patient's efficacy. And the problem with that is then, you know, if you have a 505(b)(2) approach and you simply want to show bioequivalence, like for example with a Naltrexone, you don't really want to be doing efficacy trials, because that's, you know, a lot more patients, a lot more expense, and then you have to raise that money. So overall, I would say it depends to some extent, but as a general rule, you don't want to be in that situation in the first place. And difficult to think of many drugs that have been able to use that exclusivity option to really turn themselves into a commercial success. So in terms of team, so as I was saying, if you're a startup, you don't have a team. Upset. Do I recommend adding formulation patents to extend life? Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, that's the best way you can extend life to any sort of product, and it's the hallmark of a successful 505(b)(2) application. A quick example of that, so a bad 505(b)(2) application would be taking something like, it's a good example, it's something like an aspirin tablet. So in this, you know, aspirin is used now as a 75 dose for heart, and you know, it's commonly found in a 300 dose tablet for killing. And I don't have much long time left, so I'm going to be quick. And so you can take a tablet that's 300, you cut it up and take a quarter, and you've got your 75. But if you take a formulation of an existing drug, and I'm doing this now with an ophthalmology product, and say it's only available as a tablet, and you crunch it up and you do a formulation for injecting into the ear or injecting onto the eye, sorry, distilling onto the eye, then you have a very strong formulation patent. And you're not going to find pharmacists or people compounding generic products into an eye drop or an eardrop or an injectable. That's where a strong formulation patent becomes. Whereas if you've just got a tablet that's a different dose of another tablet, then you know that's, you know, there's no strength there. People can just take a generic product. So with your team, you know, getting a team together is really important early on. If you don't have a team early on, you can bring in consultants, bring in people who can be in the board of advisors, people can help you out. I've been doing this for so long that I have people that can help me out and who can be part of my team. Somebody's asking, in the Naltrexone depot team slide, what is the descriptive difference between non-clinical safety and preclinical safety roles. You know, none really. It's just they're both in that same area, and you can't call them the same thing. So they both overlap in their roles. So last thing, financial opportunity. So with financial opportunity, it's quite simple. As I said before, you want to basically explain how much money you can make for investors. But the important thing is you don't want to overcommit to some sort of ludicrous amount of figures. A lot of people come in and say they're going to get like 50% or they're going to get like 80% or 100% of the entire market. Don't say that, because because they won't believe it. I mean, it's because mad. Better to have like a very, very small market penetration, very reasonable, and still be able to demonstrate that you're going to get a ton of money, like I demonstrate here. And then last of all, how much money you want and how you're going to spend it. In this pitch deck, I demonstrate how exactly I'm going to use the money, and that's a way for a savvy entrepreneur and team to be able to point out, we know how much this costs, we know how we're going to spend the money, and an investor, somebody who would look at this, who's got a good experience, would be able to look at this and be able to see exactly the sort of figures, and they'll say, yep, that's exactly how much that's going to cost. I would normally have soft estimates on this from CROs, and you can demonstrate that you know what you're doing, and demonstrates also your pathway to the market. And so your investment opportunity here, I've got this split up into the sort of thing that you would look at: an angel round and then a VC round. VC rounds are always somewhere between 10 and 20 million and up, because that's how much they invest. They don't like investing smaller amounts. And the angel round, if you have to do it, SBIR would be preferable. Angels are tough because they're just tough to deal with, and they often don't really get their money back. And there's whole issues with dealing with angels, and they often don't exist. It's a lot of work trying to get that money, and it's so small. So, but getting that VC money, that's the best. Any questions? Sorry, I had to rush in at the end there.
Hi, Andrew. Great presentation. Very, a lot of takeaways from this. I wonder how if the NIH HSBR funding was involved in this venture in particular, and how it helped you, if indeed it was part of it.
So I have a SBIR pending for that project. Unfortunately, the NIDA had already funded 2 other projects, and ironically, I was actually one of the companies, still am, that already got a $10 million grant, and I actually got the grant for another company I'm helping out that has a product that I would consider to be not as not as commercially viable, because they don't have a patent for it. But it was one that NIDA loved, and there's a couple of projects that NIDA loved that were already compounded components that NIDA funded to get to the market. And the problem with that is it might be a really big money pit to get to the market, and they don't have a commercial basis in terms of any sort of patent protection, because the compounds and the formulations have been around for over 20 years and are being used everywhere. So, and quite honestly, I actually spoke to NIDA about this and tried to, and they'd already, and basically NIDA didn't know what they were doing. I'll be honest, and the reviewers actually pointed out to NIDA that these are not viable as commercial, but they didn't have a lot of opportunities. And one of the problems we often see at review committees and at NIH is you get a lot of bad products. You get a lot of things that are not well envisaged, and there's not a lot of VC-backed companies and properly formatted companies with proper pitches actually doing things. And time and again, the NIH has invested in projects that don't make it to the end. And that problem is 2-part. One, the projects that they're getting sourced are coming from people who are not, appropriate for doing things that are going to become commercial. You have to have your own lab. You have to be doing 67% of the research for an SBIR. That leans it towards more, academic labs, and they don't have that vision. And the NIH themselves don't really have the expertise, and they know that. And they've been working on it assiduously to try and change the structure of how they translate things and how they invest their money to try to get it better. But it's a tough thing for them to do. So I'm still a maybe for it, but I've actually thrown a lot of my effort into trying to get one of the funded projects to move forward. If you can't beat them, join them type of approach, and hopefully make it a success. And that project's now, I'm actually writing the clinical protocols, doing the IND application for that. I'm hoping it'll move into the clinical phase next year. And I think that NIDA, even though it's a generic product, will provide enough funding that we can actually just get it out there and get it approved and get it okayed with insurers, and it will be a solution. And that's not such a bad thing and that's the sort of thing that happens when there's a national crisis type of situation. That's why it's the exception to the rule, basically.
So, Andrew, we're right at time, actually, and just a little bit after, but I did want to say thank you for this presentation. Each year you manage to wow us by, staying on topic for the day, and not just for your presentation, but also incorporating on top of IP some type of, investor mindset, and also including some instruction on capturing a pitch deck and making it almost feel like another fireside chat. So I don't know how you managed to do that, but I'm sure folks took away a lot from it. So thank you very much. And we look forward
and
to—
I'm open to everything. My email and my phone number's there. I'm very happy to look over people's specific aims if they're doing an SBIR or their pitch decks, and please use the, and help people to build up their stuff, on, pro bono. Quite happy to help people. And you'll find that with a lot of entrepreneurs and a lot of kind of consultant type people are very happy to get involved with your projects in a very sort of like casual way like that, and help you to kind of move things along. And I'm certainly happy to. So please, people, feel free to get in touch with me and send me stuff. Quite happy to spend some time on it, help you out.
Great, thank you. So our next presenter is on deck. So I know we had 5 minutes on for a break. I think while we get set up, if folks want to stand up and stretch, we'll just do a minute and